Good evening, everyone, and welcome to July's Hay Festival Book of the Month event. My name is Dr. Rachel Clark, and in a moment, I'll be introducing fellow doctor and author Suzanne O'Sullivan, whose superb book, which I have here, The Sleeping Beauties and Other Stories of Mystery Illness, we'll be discussing in a moment. A couple of things to mention just before we start. Most importantly, we're really keen for this to be an interactive discussion. So please do submit questions. You can just do that on the questions tab on Zoom. And I will chat to Suzanne for about half an hour, and we'll make sure we've got a good 15 minutes or so at the end in which to share your questions. If you would like to buy a copy of Suzanne's book, then you can do so on the Hay Festival website or from a local bookseller, of course. And lastly, just to say a huge thank you to all of you who made a donation to the Hay Festival's Future Fund when you signed up for this event. And if any of you watching this would like to do so, you can on the website afterwards. So, to introduce Suzanne, she is a consultant neurologist and has been for many years now, since 2004. She's based at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery in London, and also at a specialist unit which is based at the Epilepsy Society. She specialises in complex epilepsy, and she also has a special interest in psychogenic disorders. Her writing is not infrequently compared to Oliver Sacks, which I know is something that she's far too modest to ever agree with herself, but it is true. She is an absolutely beautiful wordsmith, wonderful ability to coin a phrase, and she draws her readers into really enthralling medical mysteries with huge tact and warmth and sensitivity towards patients. Her first book, It's All in Your Head, explored the phenomenon of psychogenic illness, and she won the Wellcome Prize for that. Her second, Brainstorm, was also highly critically acclaimed. So, Suzanne, welcome this evening. And I suppose, first of all, I'd like to ask you if perhaps you could describe in your own words what specific territory you decided to explore with the Sleeping Beauties and why.
Yeah, I mean, this book for me began when I saw a headline in on a news website that said Sweden's mystery illness. Now, I've always been sort of kind of drawn to this kind of mystery illness headline, because I know that there's one particular category of disorders that tends to get that label more than any other, and that's psychosomatic disorders. I think we still have a sort of kind of a nervousness about approaching it too directly, and we like to use euphemisms sometimes. And this particular story was about a group of children in Sweden, very young children, some as young as 7, who had fallen into this sort of coma-like state. And this coma-like state was so profound that the children they were asleep all the time. They weren't eating, they weren't speaking, they didn't open their eyes, and they could be in that state for years. And typical of a psychosomatic disorder, you know, all of their tests were normal and entirely in contrast to how they appeared. They appeared to be asleep, but their brain tests said that they were awake, which is one of the sort of hallmarks of psychosomatic disorders, is that the tests don't make sense. And when I hear stories like this in my own medical practice all the time, because I deal with people who lose consciousness for psychosomatic reasons. But, you know, to hear something that lasted so long was really, really shocking to me, and in such young children. So I contacted a doctor who was looking after some of those children, and I arranged to visit them. And the idea of arranging to visit them in the first instance wasn't about writing a book or sort of writing about them at all, really. The idea about visiting them was to try and kind of understand what I could learn from them that I could bring back to my own patients who have something similar but not the same. When I went to Sweden and I met some of these children, and these are like tiny little beautiful little girls, like rag dolls lying in their bed, floppy, unresponsive. Whoever comes into their room, they don't move. They're being fed by nasogastric tubes. they're being kept sort of healthy by their parents who do physiotherapy, etc. And I saw these children, and the thing that shocked me most was the way that people talked about what was wrong with them. Everyone wanted to know what was going on in their brain. They wanted me to say, this is what's going on in these people's brains to keep them in this state. But there was a part of this story that I haven't mentioned yet that told everyone what was going on with these young children, because they were all children of asylum-seeking families, and they were all facing deportation from Sweden. So they were all traumatized children from a small number of ethnic groups who lived in a kind of a contained area in Sweden, who went into this condition. It was obvious to me that, you know, this was what linked them. And this was where people should have been paying their attention. You know, that if they were not asylum-seeking children, if they were not facing deportation, this would not have happened. And while it might be academically interesting to people like me to know what's happening in their brain, surely what people should have been talking about was the social problem. And that really led me into this book, because I realized that when you see people in these sort of contained outbreaks of symptoms that are sometimes called mass hysteria, so where you get a group of people within a contained community who develop psychiatric and physical symptoms for psychosomatic reasons, you can really learn something from people in those groups. And what you can learn, and what I hope to learn in the writing of this book, was how is society contributing to illness? How is society determining how we ask for help and how we express distress? And how does society even tell us what is illness and what isn't? Because that's different for different groups. And having met those children, I found myself on a journey that took me to Kazakhstan, Colombia, the States, to people who had, you know, similar problems, but for very different reasons. And I believe I learned a great deal, but there's still a lot to learn still. That was a long answer, wasn't it? Yeah.
But very interesting nonetheless. And one of the things that I found very interesting when you describe this encounter, and it's shocking as a reader to learn about these children and how profoundly disabled they are, is your description of your own sense of unease in that environment. So you're in the sort of the home of two of these little girls, and what was it particularly that struck that unease into you?
I mean, it's first of all, these children are incredibly vulnerable, and they cannot advocate for themselves. Their families don't speak English. I don't speak the range of languages that were sort of that these families spoke. And they basically, the children, they looked healthy. They looked like they were asleep. They had sort of healthy complexions, healthy hair, because their parents cared for them. But then the doctor who was with me, sort of, you know, when we examined the children, there was something just terribly disturbing in the vulnerability of lifting this child up. And she's just, one of the children, her father lifted her up and walked her across the room like she was a rag doll. And the purpose of his display was to show me how deeply disabled and deeply unaware she was. But, you know, it just felt terribly voyeuristic and uncomfortable to me. And of course, I'm a doctor, as you are. So you will understand that sort of we expect when we meet people in this circumstance that our job is to intervene or to do something to help these people. But I had nothing to offer these people. And that's such a difficult situation to, you know, for a doctor. I'm not a journalist. I'm not an anthropologist. I'm a doctor, and my solution, my position is to offer solutions, and I had nothing to offer these people. And that felt terribly, terribly uncomfortable to me. And it did with every group that I met in the writing of this book.
Mm. You have this very succinct and eloquent phrase in the book. You talk about the fact that the body speaks for us. So here were these children who were mute, essentially lifeless, unresponsive, but their bodies were speaking. And for the benefit of people who haven't read the book yet, what were these children conveying through their physical form?
Yeah, I mean, first to reinforce what you've said, I mean, we have this sort of concept, I think, that thoughts live, or not everyone does, but some of us kind of think that thoughts live in our heads, you know, that they're just something swirling around in our brains. But actually, you know, our thoughts, we embody our thoughts, we physicalize our thoughts. You know, if you think of something sad, you know, you can immediately feel a change in your body. If you think of something exciting or happy, you feel the change. So we're constantly sort of embodying our thoughts. What we also do is those embodied thoughts and embodied feelings can be a sort of a way of letting ourselves know that we're upset. So if I feel I've got a headache or I'm dizzy, or I might wonder, you know, is this a symptom of something that psychologically is upsetting me? So these sort of physical symptoms are a way of alerting ourselves and others to the fact that we do not feel well for some reason. In the case of these young children, you know, it's by entering this condition, which was called resignation syndrome. I said entering, but I mean unconsciously. Really, this was sort of a culturally sort of conditioned, embodied way of saying, I need help. I can't deal with this situation, and I have no way of asking for help. Because, I mean, as we know, sort of asylum-seeking people, refugees, they really have no voice. And it's not until we see a child washed up on a beach that, you know, that there's public outrage. And then very shortly after that, we forget that again. These young people had no voice. And somehow this resignation syndrome came along as a sort of an embodiment of what they were feeling and gave voice to their distress. And it did so in a way that was much more effective than for them to simply say that they were distressed, because the world isn't prepared to listen to that form of asking for help.
So I'm going to ask a question which involves a sort of confession now, because in the case of these children, I think it's impossible for anyone to think of children who are so distressed by the prospect of their parents' asylum applications being rejected that they withdraw so profoundly from the world that apparently doesn't want them, that they stop responding at all. It's easy in this situation, I think, particularly when it's children, to empathize enormously. But the confession part of my question is, when I trained as a doctor, I think like you, I, you know, rocked up into very busy, clinically quite overwhelmed environments like A&E, where you might have someone who had just been in a multiple pile-up in resus, someone who had a new diagnosis of terminal cancer in a bed next door. And then you might have somebody who had arrived in A&E with seizures, but which were known to be functional seizures. So they did not have an organic cause in the brain. They were caused by some kind of psychological or psychosocial set of issues that person faced. And it was very, very hard not to feel angry, frustrated that this person was sort of taking care and attention and resources that you were struggling to apply to the cancer patient, the trauma patient. And did you experience that as a young doctor, as a medical student as well? And how did you come to have a more sympathetic approach?
I mean, 100%. I've felt and experienced everything that you've described. I mean, you know, I can remember certainly often as a junior doctor, we have this sort of, I think we have great difficulty accepting the unconscious nature of these things. And we have a way of classifying disability according to the underlying cause, not according to the degree of disability. So one might argue that a person who's having a seizure, whatever the cause, that's a very disabling thing that needs to be taken seriously. But, you know, certainly I, as a junior doctor, had a similar experience to you, whereas if I saw two people having a seizure and one had epilepsy, I could say, well, that's very serious. And one had dissociative or non-epileptic seizures, used to be called hysteria. One felt one sympathy level going down. But then what changed in me was, you know, I became a consultant neurologist, and that was the turning point. Because when I was a junior doctor, I didn't have to take full responsibility for people with these sort of disorders. But when I became a consultant, I realized that my specialist qualification gave me permission to, if I saw somebody with a psychosomatic disorder, and I'm a neurologist, I deal with brain diseases, that's not a brain disease technically, that I should be allowed to discharge that person and take no responsibility for them. That's how specialist medicine works. You don't have a neurological disease. You could be having 100 seizures a day, but you're not my problem if it's not epilepsy. I realized as soon as I became a consultant, if I took that attitude, there'd be an awful lot of very young people who I would be failing to help. And a lot of other doctors would take the same attitude and they would fall between stools. So I had to find a way to come to terms with this condition and to try and help. I mean, I would say that I've helped very little, but I have learned a great deal. And the first thing to say is that these are unconscious disorders. The unconscious mechanisms that keep us walking in a straight line, that keep us ignoring little changes in our bodies that are normal, that sort of allow us to pay attention. All those unconscious mechanisms, they are derailed. You don't have to, not much has to happen to derail those things, even in a healthy person. And when they are derailed, I often give the example, if you say to somebody, walk this straight line, like a sort of tandem walk in a straight line on the ground. Most people can do that if they're healthy and well. Now walk a tandem line, now walk a straight line at the top of a wall or the edge of a cliff. The entire awareness of your body changes the way you walk and affects your balance. So just changing a person's position or making someone think more about their body, tiny things affect automatic things in your body, and it all goes wrong. And they're unconscious mechanisms. And when that happens, people can have things like seizures. And what I came to realize when I saw my patients is, first of all, when they come to casualty and have seizures and go to the neurologist, that's evidence of I think some people kind of think, well, they're looking for attention or they're pretending to be sick. What you don't do if you're pretending to be sick is go to a consultant neurologist and submit yourself to lots of tests, because you will immediately sort of be revealed. People come to you with these seizures because they are that desperate for help. I also came to realize that the absolute nonsense that we believe in one type of seizure being less serious than another. If you compare epilepsy, which is a very serious disease, with hysterical seizures, 70% of people with epilepsy get better with the appropriate treatment. They tend to have fewer seizures and they're much less likely to end up in intensive care. People with hysterical seizures, 30% get better. 70% will have lifelong seizures. They have much more seizures. A large number end up in intensive care. So actually the symptoms of a psychosomatic disorder are often much more disabling and much more severe to the person who's suffering them. But I think we all have to get over this mental block of thinking because it's psychosomatic, it's the seizure is lesser in some way. If you're falling on the ground and shaking, hey, that's not okay and we need to do something. And the worst part of it, Rachel, is because we have this dismissive attitude. When I say we, I don't mean you and I mean society. It means that basically they get less treatment, but this is amenable to treatment. And that's what kind of breaks my heart about it, is if that person with the hysterical seizure went to casualty the very first time and had a really positive experience, we know that a good medical care at the start of a diagnosis like this can cure it within 24 hours, incredibly. So the best thing you can do in this circumstance is and also it's a powerful place to be as a doctor. There's not many areas of medicine where you can cure people just by having a really great consultation with someone. It's like old-fashioned medicine. So, once I realized, the power to make people better and how serious these conditions are, it really changed my view.
Do you think that part of what underlies the stigma that undoubtedly exists around psychosomatic, psychogenic illness is this idea that somehow if you suffer from a psychogenic illness, that is evidence that you are a kind of weaker or lesser person than the rest of us? And you used the word hysteria a little while ago. And of course, this is a very gendered condition. I think around 2/3 of cases are female, and we're very familiar with the strongly patriarchal roots of modern Western medical culture. Can you comment on that?
I mean, I think it's enormously stigmatized, and I do think there is a feminist issue here, but I'm not sure it's the one that is often presented. So often when we read about these disorders, I think it's suggested that women are being dismissed as having a psychosomatic disorder, which is something I have an issue with. It's like, well, why would anyone accept a diagnosis that's considered a dismissal? And I think that, you know, yes, when I was a junior doctor, we're both women. We've worked in these circumstances. You know, I've worked with men who say that men cannot have psychosomatic disorders, which is complete nonsense. So that's a little bit of the sort of the male-dominated professions is certainly a little bit of the story. But the way I think that this is more of a feminist issue is the fact that it actually is a female predominant condition. And I believe that it has been easy to dismiss for that reason. So I don't believe it's so much that women are being dismissed as psychosomatic, because I am a woman. I thoroughly investigate my patients and I give them this diagnosis, women more than men. Not because of any background or training or presumptions on my part. It is a female predominant condition. But I think that's why I think if, you know, middle-aged men who work in banks were having dissociative seizures on a regular basis, then perhaps we would have a service that doesn't dismiss them. I think it's been easy to dismiss because these conditions, they affect not only women, but often very young women. You know, who are like the children in, you know, people who have do not necessarily have the loudest voices in society. So I think it's been difficult for people to advocate for themselves. I think that the most important thing to understand is that these are unconscious conditions. And if we can believe that and give them the same standing as everything else, then it never has to be considered a dismissal.
Well, one of the things that struck me reading this book is that it seemed to me to be a quiet and elegant, but actually very forthright manifesto for how medicine should be. And actually, in some ways, the way in which the kind of medicine that we practice in the UK is falling short. So you talk about, I have a quote here, which I'll just read because it seems to sum this up. Functional neurological disorders and psychosomatic disorders in general still have to fight to shake off centuries-old assumptions to be seen as legitimate medical conditions. And of course, something you touched upon about modern medicine feeds directly into that. Many of us super specialized now. You have kidney doctors, heart doctors, brain doctors, bits of brain doctors. You don't necessarily have whole holistic people doctors. And you talk about needing to essentially refine and expand our medical model so that it is a biopsychosocial model of illness rather than disease body part. Let's fix this and forget about the person, the society, the family, everything they inhabit. That's quite radical, isn't it?
I mean, it's not, you certainly wouldn't call it radical because this idea existed in the 1970s, but the problem is that we're unwilling to take it up. You know, that when I started training, you know, there was a lot more generalists in medicine. And, you know, the neurologists I work with, some of them did some general medicine, but also they did the whole nervous system. I am a bit of a brain doctor, exactly as you described. And it's, yes, if I had epilepsy, I would like to see a doctor who knew everything there was about epilepsy. And it's not possible to do that as a generalist. So it's brilliant to have specialists. But it also lets doctors off the hook a little bit. You know, if you're sort of, you can just look at the knee or just look at the hand and miss all of the other elements of the story. So I think it's important doctors continue to, you know, because I see patients who they've been to a rheumatologist with one thing and a diabetologist with another thing and a cardiologist with another thing and then me, and they're maybe only 18 years old. Why would an 18-year-old need to see all of those specialists? So we need to sort of come together a little bit more in order to, you know, if I know that my patient it does not make sense for someone to have multiple different unconnected disorders. So we need to just, you know, being highly specialist is really beneficial in one way, but we must also, you know, make sure that we always are thorough about sort of all the other things happening with that patient. The problem when I went and visited the children in Sweden is that the doctor who facilitated my visit, a really lovely woman who was supporting lots of the asylum-seeking families, she pretty much said to me, you know, you cannot present this in your book or in any writing. You know, when I decided to write a book about it, she said, don't put in the book that it's a social disorder or anything to do with that, because the minute you put that in the book, people will just stop caring about the children. If you want people to care about the children, you have to explain the brain mechanism. And you know what? She's completely right. We don't care as much about social problems as we do about biological problems. And of course, as doctors, so many of our patients, their problems begin in the social world much more than they begin inside them biologically. And yet we're powerless to change those things. I've got lots of patients who I know, if I said, do you want this drug that costs like £10,000, or would you like this £10,000 to do something with your home? They would actually benefit more from having the social support than they would from these kind of expensive medical interventions. But still, we continue. What do? We develop more brain scans, and we do more brain scans and more blood tests, while we continue to neglect the kind of social side of medicine. And that applies not just to psychology, but all medical disorders have a social element, not just psychosomatic disorders. It's just a matter of proportion, what is maximum for each person.
Yes, yes. I'm just going to bring in a question here from the audience because it's relevant at this point. Gregory asks, in general, what is the attitude amongst doctors and GPs towards psychosomatic disorders, would you say?
I think it's, first of all, GPs, I feel, are the best at this, because GPs really have a holistic approach to medicine, whereas specialists do not. I think that improving absolutely for the better. So again, when I was a junior doctor, this wasn't taught. Even though a third of people who go to epilepsy clinics have hysterical seizures, it wasn't in our journals, it wasn't in our medical conferences, whereas it is now. And we are beginning to sort of recognize this as a disorder that needs the same scientific attention. And as soon as it gets the scientific attention, then people can start taking it seriously. However, I wouldn't like to say that everything is wonderful. I think there's a lot of fallacies. There's still a lot of doctors who think that psychosomatic is pretending or psychosomatic is acting. I wrote about in the book about a group of diplomats working in the embassy in Cuba, who people may have read about it, but it's, through a series of symptoms spreading between American diplomats in the embassy in Cuba, people began to believe they were being attacked by a sonic weapon. I won't now explain all the reasons why a sonic weapon doesn't damage the brain and this is biologically impossible. But the key factor in that outbreak was everyone said that these people, they weren't acting, they weren't pretending, the problem was real. And if you say to people, that psychosomatic illness is pretending, and these were senior doctors in the US who were saying this, then you are essentially saying to them, you might as well just keep looking for a sonic weapon, because the alternative is that you're pretending. So which is it, sonic weapon or pretending? So we know from incidents like that, there are still people who don't have a clue what psychosomatic disorders are. However, I do honestly believe it's improving. This is becoming an area of interest for medicine, and definitely things are better than they were.
Good, good. Let me ask you something that relates in a way, I guess, to the responses to all of your books. And it seems paradoxical because you are clearly an incredibly empathetic doctor, and you are trying to change things, and you are trying to educate society through your writing. And yet you have been personally attacked in the past by some patients or pressure groups who I imagine feel as though in the act of having these discussions, you are diminishing or stigmatizing their illnesses. And how have you dealt with that? Because I imagine that must be very, very difficult indeed for you as a clinician to cope with. I don't feel attacked, I'd have to say. I don't, I think that, again, there's when people have sort of criticisms that are outside of the kind of beyond what is reasonable in the scientific world, they tend to put them on places like Twitter, etc. And I think that's a sort of an echo chamber that doesn't necessarily reflect the real world. Within my actual sort of
real life, I'm much more likely to encounter people who appreciate what I've written about rather than the other way around. However, with regard to the people who do get upset, listen, they are so justified, because look at how psychosomatic disorders are presented in the public arena. You know, again, sort of say, you know, the American diplomats in Cuba were essentially, you know, it was equated to pretending. You know, does anyone want to be told to be accused of pretending to be sick? There was a group of young women in North America, in upstate New York, who developed a kind of Tourette's-like syndrome in a high school because they believed that there was poison in the high school. When that happened to them, because it was young women, again, we're back to the feminist issue, they were actually referred to as witches in a newspaper headline. And they were scrutinized for sort of family problems, and they were accused of having boyfriend problems. I mean, their medical problem was kind of reduced to the most pejorative, old-fashioned sort of form of psychosomatic disorders. And as long as we have these sort of, you know, you can hardly see a headline of a young woman having dissociative seizures without somebody mentioning Salem. Or imagine if your medical problem was compared to a sort of a you know, 300-year-old occurrence, you know, that wouldn't happen in any other medical phenomenon. So I completely, when people are upset because they feel dismissed by this diagnosis, it makes complete sense to me, and I understand it. And I think what we need to do is make this diagnosis equitable to every other diagnosis, and then people would not need to be upset.
Wholeheartedly agree, Suzanne. And it's very interesting because I think what you've just encapsulated there is part of why I chose to specialize in palliative medicine, because it is one of the very, very few areas of medicine where there really is a biopsychosocial model. So you're treating someone in the last weeks of their life in a hospice. They have physical pain caused by their metastatic cancer. They have profound existential and spiritual anguish because they know they are about to be extinguished from this world. They're terribly distressed because their children are going to be left bereaved, and so on and so on. And it's one of the few areas of medicine where addressing all of that is your job as a doctor. And so you can feel as though you're really treating human beings and not diseased body parts. And this leads on to another question, which I think is spot on, from Hilary, who asks, what happens during a very good consultation that can really help these people?
Yeah, I mean, the consultation is so important because, first of all, I think, you know, when a lot of people get this diagnosis, they feel like they've been dismissed, and a lot of information is given in the wrong way. So the first thing that happens is I think that people are led to believe that this is a diagnosis that the doctor has come to because they couldn't find anything else. You know, certainly in neurology, that's absolutely not the case. You know, much like, you know, if you diagnose Parkinson's disease, you diagnose it because it has a set number of features that fit with this diagnosis. Not, you don't do a brain scan half the time. You see the clinical syndrome and you diagnose it. So similarly, psychosomatic disorders, they have key clinical features, positive features that allow a doctor to make a diagnosis. So the first thing I think is really important. And I, with my patients, you know, if I see someone with seizures for the very first time, I will say to them, you know, I don't know yet what's wrong with you, but for all these reasons, it could be psychosomatic, or I don't generally use the word psychosomatic anymore, but it could be psychosomatic. And for all these reasons, it could be epilepsy. And if you're totally upfront from the beginning, then you don't run into the problem that then you do the brain scan, it comes back as normal. And at the next consultation, the brain scan is normal. And you're saying, well, maybe it's this other thing. So you first need to make sure that someone understands why you're making the diagnosis, so that they don't feel that you're casting around in the dark because you don't know what else it is. With my patients, I always, you know, I am awash with psychosomatic tells. I don't have a psychosomatic disorder so much, but I am the person whose hands shake when they're nervous and who sort of cries at the drop of a hat, etc. You know, and I try to familiarize people and remind them of how easily the body goes awry with small psychological triggers. And you don't have to be mad and you don't have to be vulnerable. for that to happen. You just need a trigger that is sufficient for you. I also remind people of things like, if you say to somebody that, you're really frightened and your heart's going really quickly, you would know that, A, you're not imagining that. If I'm frightened, my heart's going quickly, it is going quickly. It's not an imaginary symptom, it's real. Secondly, you wouldn't dream of saying to me, you could stop that if you wanted. You would realize that it's outside of my control, but you would also realize that perhaps there may be techniques in the future that I could learn that would help me to sort of not get into that condition in the future. So I try to I think it's important to normalize the symptoms. We all get it in different degrees. Not most of us, fortunately, don't get disabled. It's not a diagnosis of exclusion. It's not synonymous with madness. So a lot of people feel that, you're saying I'm mad. You feel that, I've got some major psychiatric problem. You don't have to have any particular psychiatric vulnerability at all for this to happen. I think I'm quite a fan of lots of Freud's work, but he's got a lot of hangovers that we're still trying to shake. One of which is that if you have a psychosomatic disorder, something terribly traumatic must have happened to you. Hey, that's probably not even the case. It could easily be that you just had an injury and you're struggling to get over it, or you had an illness and you're struggling to get over it. So I think for me, to discuss, you need time and you need to be, well armed with the sort of information that allows you to burst the myths for the patient that tend to make them feel dismissed.
Absolutely. So that sounds like, if you were summing that up in one word, it's communication, and it's the therapeutic relationship between doctor and patient.
And again, I think that sometimes medical students kind of think, oh, this isn't a very sort of exciting part of medicine. It is phenomenal to be able to sit down and use nothing more than your ability to communicate with a person in order to alleviate their symptoms. I'm not saying it happens often, but every now and again, you can say this to someone and then you see them a week later and they're cured. And, that it's phenomenal I wish it was always that easy, but, it is phenomenal to be able to just be an old-fashioned doctor who communicates with their patient and alleviates their symptoms that way, instead of all the time turning to MRI scans, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a question from Amy who apologizes because she's bringing the conversation to COVID, but it's a good question. In your view, has the pandemic shown any more examples of these kind of culturally defined psychogenic illnesses? And is there any chance that more scientists are taking them more seriously as a result of the pandemic?
I absolutely don't think that there's a sign that scientists are taking them more seriously. I would say the opposite. Yeah. First of all, with my own patients with existing psychosomatic disorders, I've seen a sort of interesting improvement in them, actually. And I think it's because, all of the things that trigger their symptoms suddenly were being removed from their environment. So in some people, it's actually alleviated, the commute and the working things and all these sort of things. I think that basically it is absolutely certain that there will be people who are suffering psychosomatically in the pandemic. It's unavoidable. I mean, who did not? If anyone didn't, then I'm jealous of them. Who did not take their own temperature a ridiculous number of times during that first couple of weeks of the pandemic? I had to go out and buy a thermometer, and every day I thought, oh, I'm sure I have a temperature, and I didn't. But what happens in a pandemic is that you are essentially being ordered to search your body for symptoms. You've got people at the highest level are saying to you, search your body for symptoms, hide away, something frightening is happening. And of course, that was all necessary because something terribly frightening was happening. But what will happen is that you will have a proportion of people who, if you search your body, you will find symptoms. Because most of the time, a healthy body is not within our awareness. So everyone, as they walk up the stairs, their heart rate will go higher. And our brains know, hey, that's normal. Don't worry about it. We don't pay any attention to it. Now imagine that I'm in a pandemic and I walk up the stairs and I'm worried about symptoms and I'm paying attention. I notice my heart rate has gone up. When you stop filtering out those normal bodily sensations and paying attention to your body, you will invariably notice things that have always been there, but suddenly they become a cause for concern. And once you start noticing things, it's very hard to unnotice them. So I have absolutely no doubt that a proportion of people who are suffering during the pandemic did not necessarily contract the virus. And I say, as a doctor who volunteered in ITU and saw it at its worst, so I know there's a range of different ways for people to suffer in this pandemic. And but the thing, again, I'm back to a familiar theme, which is what is driving me mad is how news programs and sort of mainstream media refuse to acknowledge this as a type of suffering. If there's any mention at all that somebody's symptoms could have been psychosomatic, it is mentioned in these terms. This woman was dismissed as psychosomatic. This woman was dismissed as anxious. Again, we're back in that scenario. If that's how you voice it, then you are backing someone into a corner and saying, you cannot have a psychosomatic disorder, because if you are, it means there's nothing wrong with you. And then what you're doing is depriving people of one of the possible explanations for their symptoms, and one that perhaps could be amenable to intervention.
So in an ideal world, what do you hope to achieve with this book, Suzanne?
I mean, we're really at the real infancy of how we deal with these disorders. What I really, what happened to me when I went on this journey for this book was I started off as a very Western doctor. I'm quite anti over-scanning, etc. I think these things are dangerous to start with. But I visited these communities in remote places, and I discovered that they were so much more sophisticated without their scans at knowing how to deal with these, a community in the Mosquito Coast who had contagious seizures. And they had sort of folk illness explanations for why these seizures occurred, but it was very sophisticated in the end. It was a way of, illness was a way for young women to express a particular type of distress, which resulted in the community coming together, not doing what we do in this country, which is do a scan and then lock them away somewhere where no one can see them. The community came together and supported these people. You get the symptom, it attracts community support, and then you get better. So I'd really like, us to see this as something that is attracting support rather than, forcing people to hide away.
Imagine that as a model for future society.
We can only hope.
Indeed. Suzanne O'Sullivan, thank you so much. We have to stop there, and I'm really sorry because I would love to keep talking for hours longer. It is a really wonderful book, and anyone who's watching, I heartily recommend you buy it. It's one of the most fascinating books I have read for a very, very long time, and it is beautifully written, and there are definitely shades of Oliver Sacks. So thank you so much. And just before we finish, one more thing to say, which is our book of the month for next month. So the August Hay Festival book of the month will be The Country of Others by Leila Slimani. And there will be a live Q&A scheduled for Tuesday, the 17th of August. It's free. You can register. It's open now. So do sign up for that if you'd like to. And many, many thanks, Suzanne O'Sullivan. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.